My name is Marceline Abbott, and on the night of my wedding, my father turned my vows into a punchline. He stood there, glass raised high, smiling at the crowd as if he owned the moment, then laughed, calling me the girl who types for real heroes. The room erupted in laughter. I didn't. It wasn't the first time he'd mocked me, but it was the last time I'd let him. In that instant, beneath the applause and the golden lights, something inside me broke, not out of rage, but from years of being quietly erased by the man who taught me how to speak, then never listened. He thought it was just a joke. But that night, the truth I'd buried for years was already waiting behind the microphone, ready to rewrite his story with mine. I'd long accepted that my father could turn any family gathering into a campaign event. Still, I never imagined he'd turn my wedding into one too. Under the soft gold lights of the Mayflower Ballroom, he stood before 200 guests, hand resting on the microphone like a man born to control a crowd. His voice rolled through the room with the polished ease of a career politician, each syllable sharpened for applause. "My daughter has always been brilliant," he began, pausing just long enough to make sure every eye was on him. "At typing other people's words." The laughter erupted on cue. Crystal glasses clinked. Someone whistled. The sound scraped against my nerves. Bright, hollow, merciless. Beside me, Ethan's fingers tightened gently around mine beneath the tablecloth. I smiled the way a person smiles when they've been taught that silence keeps the peace. Inside, though, something pulsed, slow, heavy, deliberate, as if my heart had started counting down to detonation. I scanned the room, letting my gaze drift toward the front table. The Deputy Secretary of State sat there, expression unreadable, flanked by 2 NATO representatives and several national security officials. None of them laughed. They knew, and they knew I knew they knew. But no one spoke. No one dared to correct the story, because to do that would expose everything my father had claimed as his own. I drew a steady breath, the smile still painted on my face, and let the laughter wash past me. This wasn't the first time he'd told that story. It would, however, be the last time he finished it without the truth. I grew up in a house where every dinner felt like a hearing, and every silence carried the weight of an unspoken verdict. At our table, my father filled the air with declarations about order, legacy, and the power of a man's voice. My mother, once a gifted diplomat, had boxed up her awards after marrying him, retreating from the State Department until she became little more than a quiet backdrop to his career. In that atmosphere, I learned how to live by stillness. Each time I tried to speak, he cut me off. Each time someone praised me, he reminded me it was only luck, that greatness belonged to those who did real work. I stopped answering and started observing, absorbing every detail the way an analyst collects intelligence on an adversary. He used words to define me. I used silence to reclaim myself. When I told him I'd been accepted into the State Department, he smirked and called it cute. And from then on, a mocking nickname trailed me to every family gathering. One evening, after he repeated the story yet again, my mother pulled me out onto the balcony. "Don't fight him," she whispered. "He only fears the day you surpass him." I asked softly what she feared. She hesitated, eyes downcast. That he might be right. That night, I passed her doorway and saw her alone, staring at an old photo of herself, shaking hands with the French ambassador. The lamplight caught the glass, reflecting a woman who had once spoken for a nation and was now a shadow. In that moment, I knew I would never let myself fade into a second shadow. 2 years before the wedding, Washington stayed awake under the glow of breaking news. NATO's defense network had been breached, the risk of a catastrophic leak seconds away. Deep in the State Department's basement, I stood at the center of a wall of screens streaming encrypted code, my team sprinting against the clock. One wrong move could tip the world toward war. "Route the data through the secondary protocol. No access until I give the green light," I ordered. Nobody questioned me. Ethan Crawford, then a White House representative, watched from the edge of the room, his eyes a mix of disbelief and respect as he saw me pull the threads together. We stopped the breach with seconds to spare. 3 weeks later, the NATO Cybersecurity Accord was signed, restoring allies' trust. Washington applauded the man who signed it, Senator William Abbott, but the draft had been mine from the first word to the last, sent through a secure channel with my name scrubbed for classification. In the official record, there was no Marceline Abbott. He took the credit. I held my silence. I told myself it was worth it, that sometimes the one who writes history has to disappear to keep the peace. But as I watched him bask in praise for words he hadn't written, a single thought hardened in my chest. If he ever tried to turn my silence into his triumph, I would make sure the world learned whose hand had written history. I sat in my father's Capitol office, surrounded by framed handshakes and glossy campaign photos, evidence of a career built more on image than on substance. On his desk, a tumbler of whiskey, a silver microphone, and the speech he'd scribbled for my wedding. "It'll be grand, Martzi," he said, eyes bright with the thought of cameras and donors. "Reporters, half the Senate. Legacy, dear," I asked, cool as the late light slipping through the blinds. "Do they?" He smiled, offered his favorite line. Let him handle the optics. It landed like an accusation. He wasn't going to speak as a father tonight. He would speak as a politician. I left his office feeling cataloged, an asset to be displayed. Ethan listened without interrupting when I told him, when I mentioned the Capitol press invite. His jaw tightened. "Then let's give him the right audience," he said. He told me he'd arranged for the feed. My father's words would play beyond the ballroom. Millions might hear the joke he planned to tell. I closed my laptop at the hotel and named a file Operation Mayflower, Docs. No drama, only a plan. I moved like a coordinator on a tight timeline. Invitations went out quietly to the Deputy Secretary, 2 NATO advisors, the National Security Committee Director, and a handful of colleagues who knew the Accord's true author. My seating chart put my father between witnesses who could authenticate the truth with a simple nod. Ethan positioned himself near the soundboard, ready. A day before, an anonymous email arrived. "You think you're safe because no one knows what you did? But some of us do." I printed it, sealed it in an envelope with red tape, evidence kept for the moment it mattered. On the balcony that night, Ethan asked, "Do you want me to stop him if he crosses the line?" I shook my head. "You'll know when to speak." Rain tapped the windows as I rehearsed the sequence in my head. Guess, camera angles, the precise pause that would hand the stage to truth. Then a last text. "Tomorrow. You won't be the only one exposed." I set the phone down without fear. If exposure was coming, I'd make sure it landed where it belonged. The Mayflower's ballroom glowed with that soft, expensive kind of gold light that makes everything look perfect, even when it isn't. Laughter rippled through the air, clinking against glassware and the faint perfume of power. I moved through it, all feeling half present, half detached, caught between 2 worlds that had never belonged together. One was family, the other politics, and my father had spent his life teaching me the 2 were the same thing. He thrived here, surrounded by men who admired his charm and women who'd memorized his headlines. He wasn't a father tonight. He was a senator performing on home turf, shaking hands, trading smiles, feeding on attention. I felt the weight of every glance that turned my way. Not because I was the bride, but because I was his daughter, the quiet supporting role in his ongoing campaign for admiration. When he lifted the microphone, the laughter died as if the room had been trained to obey. His voice rolled out smooth and confident. "My daughter Marceline has always been brilliant," he said, pausing just long enough for effect. "And careful, always behind the scenes, always the quiet helper." The crowd laughed on cue. I could almost hear the click of every performative smile. Then he added, "She's doing some work for the State Department now, the kind of job where you file documents and keep the coffee warm. Perfect for her nerves." The projector behind him flickered. The wedding slideshow dissolved into the live feed from the press cameras. Every word he spoke now scrolled as subtitles on the broadcast. streaming to whoever happened to be watching online. A few guests looked at their phones. Others shifted uneasily. At the front table, the Deputy Secretary of State put down his glass, his eyes narrowing with quiet disapproval. My father didn't notice. He was too busy performing, too proud to see the stage tilting beneath him. Then came the line that cut the air clean in half. You know, when she told me she worked on the NATO cybersecurity accord, I nearly laughed. My little girl helping draft international treaties? Adorable. The Deputy Secretary's posture changed. He straightened. No longer an amused guest, but a man measuring the room. Across the table, Ethan met my gaze. His eyes said everything. Time. I gave a single nod. The smallest movement, invisible to anyone else. But it was enough. The operation had begun. Ethan stood. The soft hum of the room collapsed into silence. The stage lights caught on his black suit as he walked forward, each step deliberate. "Senator Abbott," he said, his tone even. "May I say a few words?" My father grinned, oblivious. "Of course, son. I hope you inherited her patience." Laughter rippled again, thinner this time, uncertain. When Ethan took the microphone, the change was instant. The warmth drained from the room, replaced by something sharper. "Do you remember the NATO cybersecurity accord you signed 2 years ago?" Ethan asked. My father smiled proudly. "Of course. One of my finest moments." "Then let me share something with the people here tonight," Ethan said, his voice low but caring. "The person who wrote that entire document, every clause, every safeguard that stopped an international crisis, is standing right next to you." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was heavy. I heard the faint clatter of a dropped fork somewhere near the back of the room. "That's a funny story, Ethan," my father said, forcing a chuckle. "She helped with notes." Ethan didn't let him finish. "No, sir, she wrote it. I was in that room when she saved the negotiation, when she saved us all." The Deputy Secretary rose from his chair, his voice steady and loud enough for the microphones to catch. "That's true," he said. "Marceline Abbott didn't type history. Senator, she wrote it." A murmur spread through the guests, disbelief folding into realization. I watched the cameras swing toward my father, his face pale under the lights. Across the room, one of his old campaign advisors stared down at the table, guilt written in the slump of his shoulders. The message I'd received the night before, "Tomorrow, you won't be the only one exposed," suddenly made sense. They'd known the truth was a weapon, and they'd been right. But they never imagined I'd use it this way. Clean, quiet, irrefutable. Ethan placed the microphone back on the table. No applause followed. Only silence. Thick and suffocating. The kind that seals a verdict. My father looked lost, his gaze moving from face to face, as if searching for an ally. Then his eyes found mine. "You wrote that?" he whispered. I met his stare without blinking. Now everyone knows whose words they were. Under the harsh white light, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. No longer the man who commanded every room, but the one thing he'd always feared becoming. Irrelevant in the presence of truth. When Ethan set the microphone down, the sound echoed once, then vanished into a silence unlike any I'd ever known. It wasn't the hush of shock or shame. It was the silence of a fallen empire. My father remained standing, shoulders trembling, hand frozen against the table as though the wood could anchor him. His face had drained of color, his mouth half open, eyes darting across the crowd in search of an ally who no longer existed. No one spoke. No one moved to save him. The television cameras still burned his image onto the screen, the caption beneath reading the Deputy Secretary's final words. "She didn't type history. Senator, she wrote it." Every syllable struck like a bullet. In the second row, my mother's eyes shimmered, not with sorrow, but with release. 30 years of quiet endurance dissolving into something close to peace. She met my gaze and gave a single nod. That was all. I understood. The battle she couldn't win. Her daughter had ended differently. My father tried to smile, lips trembling, the gesture collapsing before it reached his eyes. I stepped forward, brushed my fingers against the cold microphone, and whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "It's okay, Dad. You can sit down now." He sank into his chair, staring at nothing. The lights above no longer flattered him. The man who once measured honor by applause now learned what it truly meant, in words that didn't need to be spoken. The jazz band shifted into a slow, mournful tune. Ethan took my hand, and together we walked past him. As we did, I paused, leaned close, and said quietly, "Now everyone knows whose story it was." There was no triumph in me, no anger left to burn, only calm, the kind of silence so complete that even the room seemed to breathe slower just to listen to it. 2 weeks after the wedding, Washington felt heavy with the kind of winter rain that blurred everything it touched. Streets, windows, even memories. To everyone else, the scandal had faded, replaced by fresher headlines. But inside me, the storm was still turning, low and quiet. One morning, while sorting through unopened wedding gifts, I found a plain white envelope without a postmark. My name was written in blue ink at the corner. For Marceline. The handwriting stopped my breath. His handwriting. I sat down before I opened it. Inside was a folded copy of the NATO Cybersecurity Accord, the document that had once carried his signature and his glory. The same paper that built his reputation, that crowned his career. But now, another line had been added at the bottom, scrawled in the same familiar blue. I finally read what I signed. "You didn't write for me. You wrote for the world. With respect, Dad." I read it once, then again, then a third time, until the words blurred. There was no "I'm sorry." No "I love you." No attempt to rewrite what had already been said in public. And yet, I knew, for a man who had lived his life believing that words were weapons, those two, with respect, were his surrender, his apology, and his acknowledgement all in one. That was his language, and for the first time, he spoke mine. I framed the letter and set it beside our wedding photograph. 2 documents, side by side, one political, one personal, both bearing the same names. William Abbott and Marceline Abbott. A father and a daughter. 2 signatures, one truth. As the rain tapped against the window, I felt a strange calm settle inside me. Not because he understood me at last, but because he had finally chosen silence over defense. Because after all the noise, he had learned the language I had spoken all my life, the quiet, undeniable language of respect. A year later, the city had softened again. Washington in the morning was all pale light and quiet glass, the kind of calm that comes only after storms. I sat in my new office on the top floor of the State Department, the small brass plate on my desk reading, "Marceline Abbott, Deputy Director, Office of International Security." The sun rose over Capitol Hill, the light spilling across the buildings my father had once ruled with his voice. Now, it simply warmed the marble. Indifferent, timeless. Ethan came in carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one beside my keyboard, his smile easy, familiar. "Still the quiet one, huh?" he teased. I smiled back. "Quiet works." On the wall behind me hung 2 framed photographs. The first was from our wedding, Ethan and me standing beneath the chandelier, my parents in the distance, a wash of golden light touching everyone equally. The second hung beside it, the image of me shaking hands with the deputy secretary the same night, that moment when truth finally stood where it belonged. Ethan studied the photos for a while before speaking. "You didn't just rewrite his legacy," he said softly. "You completed it." I turned toward the window, watching the morning sun glance off the Capitol dome. "He thought legacy was what you tell," I said. "But it's what you leave behind when you stop talking." A breeze slipped through the cracked window, stirring the curtain like a slow exhale. I could still see flashes of that night, The shimmer of stage lights, the weight of the microphone, the look in my father's eyes right before he understood. For years, he had filled every silence in our lives with noise. Now, even in memory, the silence felt like peace. I lifted the coffee to my lips, the warmth grounding me in the present. The past no longer burned. It only glowed faintly, like the last trace of sunset before dawn. Some wars end not with surrender, I murmured, almost to myself, but with silence, when truth becomes the only survivor. Outside, the sun climbed higher, flooding my desk with light. The story didn't end with applause or forgiveness. It ended with stillness, the kind earned only by someone who had learned that the truest power isn't in speaking louder, but in knowing when you no longer need to.